Happy Friday. What a week it's been. Jordan and I are just going to call each other names and insult different pieces of legislation and attack political parties. And no, we won't. But we hear that that's what's happening in the broader vibe and seems to be dominating the news. And frankly, we all got a lot of more serious stuff to be dealing with. So much for the Twitter fights or the Truth Social fights. Let's get into the real substance of what matters. And what matters is that legislators, despite the noise sometimes in Washington, are passing state laws. Our audience knows that. And we would prefer and want and desire a national privacy law, more logical to comply with. I was reading a number of privacy policies recently. I find it very interesting, sorry. But I was reading a couple to see how people are updating to reflect the different state laws. And they're a mess because every state, and again, not arguing as a former state legislator, I understand state legislators will legislate. It's what they do. Hard to tell them not to, unless you can really point to a real federal effort. So let's have the federal effort to tell them that that's coming. But in the absence, they do their thing. Our plea typically is take note of the fact that you are not the only state in the country and that organizations writing those policies need to do so in a way that is logical to consumers. So if you say this must be on your homepage and it must say my state, California, gives you this right, well, now I need to have 10 links, multiple policies. So as I've been reading the policies, and do you remember a time when people wanted mandating logical, easy to read policies? You now cannot write. If you do business in multiple states, you cannot write a comprehensible policy. You must say, here's what California requires. Here's what this state requires. Here's what that state requires. Here's these states all require that, but then here's the one-off where that's different. You created a monster. Talk to each other and coordinate. And is there some reason you really are diverging? Then fine. But you're just saying it differently sometimes, but mandating that it be addressed with very specific language. So, okay, legislators be legislating. What is it that they are doing? And Jordan Francis, great member of our ledge team, who does a lot of the work watching those hearings to let folks know what's going on, analyzing, comparing, tracking, and discussing state legislation, has focused in particular recently at a core data protection concept that is increasingly a heated part of the debate in these state laws. What's that concept? Data minimization. Now, not a new thing, right? The fair information practices, the early thinking about what data protection laws should look like, always included some notion of data minimization. But the reality is that in US law, we all led with notice, with choice, and now the laws are becoming more nuanced, requiring much more specific, tighter language and restrictions, and getting a little more serious about data minimization. The very initial proposals, I'd say, nodded to data minimization, but in the end of the day, focused on, well, if you declare it in your privacy policy and you are transparent, then you minimize by not collecting broader than what you specified in your policy. So Jordan really took a look at what was going on with those initial spate of laws. And I think interestingly has conceptualized how to categorize those, and then a more recent trend of much more specific, narrower, but yet confusingly complex because it's not clear what standard is really being applied when you look hard. So anyway, Jordan, can you share with us a bit? And our team has posted or will post in a moment the actual report that we're talking about. It's called Data Minimization's Substantive Turn, Key Questions and Operational Challenges Posed by New State Privacy Legislation. At the end of the day, that's what we're all about. We don't want to debate. Some people think, great, let's have all the data we need for every possible purpose. We need that for innovation. Others concerned want restrictions. there are different points of view. Our goal is, here are the implications of going this way. Here are the implications of going that way. Here are the complexities you create. Understand what you're doing so that reasonable organizations can comply with it. And if there are barriers that are being created and people can't do the business that we think is reasonable or provide the services that consumers want, we can sort of see that instead of leaving it gray and fuzzy, and we'll learn that out in litigation or enforcement. So, Jordan, over to you. Policy Council, U.S. legislation, and FPF. What's this report about? What are the high-level takeaways? And what do you mean by data minimization's substantive turn?
Thank you, Jules. So I think of this paper as sort of phase 2 in 3 phases of work that I've been doing on data minimization for really almost 2 years now. And phase 1 was very much first just sort of noticing this phenomenon and locking in on what I think is one of the most important sort of policy debates in state privacy legislation right now. And as a member of FPS legislation team, my full-time job is just tracking privacy legislation. I'm out reading hundreds of bills. I've got a couple hundred this year I'm looking at. I'm watching the hearings. I'm reading documents that people submit. And I'm really trying to filter through all that noise and identify, what's important, what are the really key fights and debates and tensions here. And this data minimization question is something that really started to dominate my year last year. As you mentioned, data minimization is this really old principle. And it's often been pretty uncontroversial that when you have a specified purpose for which you're collecting personal data, limit your collection to what you really need for that purpose. And this has been baked into a lot of the state privacy laws. And that looks like this language that we see around limit your collection of personal data to what's, I think, adequate, proportionate, and necessary for the purposes that you disclose. And that operates against a sort of baseline principle in American privacy law that typically you can collect personal data and use it in any way that you want, as long as you're being transparent about that. And this has become the norm in the state privacy laws. But in the last couple of years, we've started to see this really big pivot towards data minimization. And it's called data minimization, but I think I'd argue that what we're talking about in the Maryland law and these new laws is kind of a broader concept that goes beyond what you traditionally think about as data minimization. But I think this really started a couple years ago in the federal bills like the ADPPA, and it sort of percolated its way into the state bills. And we started to see a number of bills last year floating this really new and arguably pretty restrictive language. We saw it in Vermont, I think we saw it in Maine, in Massachusetts, maybe Michigan, but most importantly in Maryland. Maryland was the first one of these state comprehensive laws to enact this new requirement, which instead of saying, limit your collection of data to what you're disclosing, it says you have to limit your collection of personal data to what's reasonably necessary and proportionate to provide or maintain a specific product or service requested by the consumer. And for sensitive data, it goes even further. It says that you have to limit your collection, processing, and sharing of sensitive data to what's strictly necessary to provide a requested product or service. And you can't sell sensitive data at all. That's obviously a pretty big departure from what the other states have done. And this year, we're tracking a number of other bills that are following this Maryland language. And I think that this is a really contentious policy issue. And so what I've tried to do in this report is sort of just identify this landscape. So phase 2 was taking all this that I've been observing over the last 2 years and trying to put it into a digestible landscape piece that identifies here are the different standards and here are some of the things to think about with respect to how you're interpreting this. So on the one hand, you have this majority position, this idea of limit collection to what you're disclosing. On the other hand, you have this new Maryland language, which it's the only state to have this in a comprehensive law. We see some similar language in some sectoral ones, but Maryland's really standing alone there. And then you also have, interestingly, California, which has done its own thing. It has this really interesting reasonable expectation standard in its regulations, which I think is sort of between these two kind of positions. It lays out a couple different factors that are sort of like Maryland and maybe also sort of like the other states. And the distinction that I draw between these is sort of a procedural rule and a substantive rule. In that the procedural rule, the one that the majority of states are doing, really focuses on steps that you can take as a controller that are within your power to dictate what you're allowed to do. It's about making the right disclosures. It's about obtaining consent. And I characterize the Maryland one as substantive because it's really about the nature of the product or service that you're providing. It's about my relationship as a consumer to a business. What is the business offering to me, and what's necessary for them to offer that product to me. And so I've tried to lay out sort of, these are the 3 different standards. Here are different ways to think about them conceptually. And then I dive into a lot of sort of unresolved questions about the Maryland language. And I think that the Maryland language is really paradoxical in a way. On the one hand, you can look at it and you can say, okay, limit your collection of personal data to what's necessary to provide a requested product or service. That's extremely restrictive. That's really narrow. And I think that that's the intent behind a lot of this, is this idea that, maybe companies have had too much leeway. The argument in favor of it being that, companies have had so much leeway to sort of do whatever they want. Consumers expect them to only collect data in the context of providing a product to them. So there's an intent to limit that. That's a very narrow and restrictive reading of Maryland. On the other hand, you can look at this language and say, what's necessary to provide a requested product or service? Well, that's whatever I can justify as a business need. That's targeted advertising. That's product improvement. That's selling personal data if it means that I can have free access to this content that otherwise I wouldn't be able to. That's an extremely broad and arguably pretty permissive reading of this. So how can this language be both of these things at once? I think because of its inherent vagueness, that we don't have a lot of meat on this standard. There aren't factors to tell you what's necessary. There's not a framework for thinking through what's necessary. And so until you get guidance or enforcement or any kind of amendments to add extra detail to this, both of those interpretations are plausible interpretations. And it's going to be on businesses in the interim to decide based on their own risk tolerance and what they think is going to happen with interpretation to decide sort of how to approach compliance with this.
Yeah, so I want to just frame how when you look at the current FTC history of how U.S. law has worked, how big a change this is. And even when you look at the European model and its restrictions, how this perhaps goes far, far beyond. So on the U.S. side, we haven't really truly had a rule that, well, as long as you disclose it, it's okay, right? We've had sort of a tiered set of standards where if it's really important because it could cause harm or it just really might bother you, or you might not go ahead and do the transaction, I need to tell you that information in some very visible way. When I was the Consumer Affairs Commissioner in New York City, one of my first cases, the mayor used to hold a talk show on Friday and everybody would call in. And after the new year, he got tons of calls. People purchased TVs, big box products at Circuit City, one of the big electronics chains, not around anymore. And some of them returned it for whatever reason. And then they were hit with a restocking fee. And people said, I wouldn't have bought this if I realized that, it was the wrong shape, the size, it was too big for my wall, whatever it is. And Circuit City, so I brought an action against them. And Circuit City complained to me, you anti-business, Luddite, you, we disclosed it very clearly on all the receipts. Everyone who purchased it got it on the receipt. I said, when do you get your receipt? After you purchased the product. You need to disclose this significant penalty, like you can't really return it without a 15% fee somewhere before somebody makes the transaction on the way into the store or register where the product was. And if it's maybe less consequential, then it could be linked in the terms of service in the privacy policy. But in the Sears case, the FTC said, wait a second, even though I'm paying people to download an app to let Sears track my shopping behavior, people were being paid, this app tracked so much, including everything you typed in, sensitive data, passwords, burying it deep in a terms of service, in a privacy policy, not enough. You have to more boldly sort of disclose it, right? So we did have transparency, but the FTC, depending on the consequence, would push that transparency bigger, bolder, and you might even have to expressly, acknowledge and click and say yes and so forth if it was something very substantial, like maybe I'm selling your personal information. Okay. And then the second thing is, even if you did all that disclosing, if it was unfair in some way because it was going to create some risk of harm that you couldn't reasonably avoid, which by doing a lot of transparency, maybe your consumer could say, well, I don't want this. But if it was a risky thing, then it didn't even matter about the disclosure. The FTC could argue that what you did was unfair, right? But by default, you could do stuff as long as you disclosed it well enough, if it was sensitive and so on and so forth, and you didn't go do harmful things that the FTC could then say that was unfair, right? So that was sort of the U.S. innovation model. By default, you can do stuff with these two outer boundaries. In Europe, we know, no, you may not collect anything by default. You need to have a legal basis. And if it's a contract, we now have guidance for, in a number of cases, that is a very narrow thing. That really is a very strictly necessary standard. And that but there is a legal basis called legitimate interest, which kind of looks like that unfairness standard where you can do stuff and you have to assess the risks and you have to mitigate the risks. And then you have to decide whether or not there's a balance of interest here between kind of your general business interest and the risks that you created and whether you mitigated them. And you might need to give them an opt-out in many, but not all cases, if you can, if it's feasible, because of this sort of balance. And so here, we've arguably gone far beyond, and you discuss a bit of the European sort of context in seeing how that set of interpretations may provide some guidance, but again, recognizing that there are other bases that you can use if you're not able to live with the fairly narrow guidance that the EDPB and some of the regulators have provided for that contractual necessity standard.
Yeah, I think that you teed that up exactly as how I would describe it. It is, I think that what we're calling data minimization under the Maryland standard isn't really data minimization in the historical sense you think about it, in the sense that it's articulated in GDPR. I see it as much more like a lawfulness of processing requirement. But as you point out, under GDPR, you have a lot of different legitimate legal bases you can rely on. It's performance of a contract. It's also legitimate interest. It's also consent. There are three other ones. In that, if you're this Maryland standard and you're doing this thing that sort of looks like performance of a contract, saying only collect data to provide a requested product or service, but you don't have any alternatives like consent or like legitimate interests, you arguably create this pressure to read this in a way to incorporate all of those things. But then does that just weaken the standard so that it doesn't do what you intended it to do?
It's certainly not what the civil society advocates who were the big proponents intended, right? That strictly necessary means that you can interpret a lot of things as necessary because you think it's necessary. Although, again, this has really been the tension in Europe where ad-supported businesses say, well, it kind of necessary. I mean, it ain't necessary to run the service, but it's necessary for me to pay the people to run the service, which might otherwise be free. And, well, okay, can you charge? And so on and so forth, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you're, in a way, asking data minimization to do more work than it's capable of doing in this context.
Interesting. So let's talk practical, though, right? What are we talking about excluding product development? So security and fraud, it seems like there's an understanding, sometimes it's even spelled out, that these are, uses that are reasonably necessary. Although, again, how broadly one goes when it comes to security and fraud can be debated. But then here are the questions. Analytics, product development, third-party advertising. Sale, I think we know the answer, right? We've answered that sale is not a minimization type, type thing. But research, one of my pet peeves as a Maryland resident in an area that is very dependent on research. NIH is in our backyard, and research is not necessary, but research is a key way that corporate data, because research is not solely let's just do a small experiment, or let's only use health and medical data under that framework, right? We want to research whether the platforms are doing good or bad things when it comes to children. We want to research the effect of Amazon sales on the economy. There's a lot of reasons why we want corporate data being used for their own research, obviously about their market and future markets and so forth, but also for all the broader societal needs. Sometimes you can de-identify that data. Sometimes your report is de-identified, but you need the actual granular data to be collected and saved. Maryland, some states have some exceptions and flexibility for research. Maryland does not. Shame on them for that. Product development. Again, the Europeans have said product development is not part of contractual necessity. I would disagree because I think people expect products to, develop in advance. But again, product development clearly could be done under legitimate interest. Is product development what users have requested, or is it necessary? Well, they're requesting the service they're looking at. They're not requesting the new features. On the other hand, if you don't get new features, I don't know. I expect the apps I use and my phone to get new features. So product development, AI, if I'm using the service to build, machine learning models to add some new features or do new things, is that really where the rubber hits the road?
Yeah, I think that in general, under the narrow view interpretation of Maryland, a lot of those things probably arguably aren't necessary to provide a requested product or service. I do think that it's going to sort of stress test the exceptions to these laws, because these state comprehensive laws, we call them comprehensive, they have lots of exceptions. The Maryland one, it has an exception generally to the law for like fraud prevention and certain security purposes, for solely internal uses for certain activities that are aligned with consumer expectations. So I think, if you take if you take a restrictive interpretation of the Maryland law, it's going to increase reliance on a lot of these exceptions, and then you're going to have to stress test in enforcement. What does it actually mean for something to be a solely internal use? What does it mean? What's the scope and bound of these security exceptions that before, like, you didn't necessarily need to rely on if you were able to collect data because you disclosed that. I do think that for some of these things like artificial intelligence development, big open questions. And I think the key things to unpack in the Maryland standard is, what's a requested product or service? Does that mean that if I'm a business, I can flood consumers with consent prompts that maybe aren't up to the standard of consent in the law because it's not an actual consent requirement, but I make people tick boxes before getting the product or service saying, you let me use your data for product improvement as part of this product? Is that now the requested product or service? Unclear. What's necessary? As you mentioned, is analytics necessary? Is product improvement necessary? There are certain things you can look at, but if you look at, say, how similar requirements are interpreted under GDPR, maybe not. Maybe that's not necessary for providing a product or service. I think one of the biggest things that's under discussed about Maryland is that it maybe arguably bans all third-party data use. If you can only collect personal data to provide a requested product or service by the consumer to whom the data relates, if I'm a third party and collect means to also buy, license, lease personal data, arguably, I don't know that I can collect personal data to provide a product or service requested by that individual. By definition, I'm a third party. I don't have a relationship with them. So I don't think that was intended in the Maryland standard, but I think if you take this language literally, could be what it does.
Yeah. So, I mean, look, I think if you don't live in the world of sort of data and business and marketing, so, well, so what? So you don't buy any data. But I mean, consider, you deal with a hotel chain, you deal with an airline, you deal with different businesses. They have maybe people who signed up for, an account, and they have just an email address, a name and an email. You don't know whether your customers live in your area. You don't know whether they're seniors. You don't know whether they are younger. You don't know any demographics or intelligence about them. That makes your marketing blunt and inefficient. You got to mail your entire list, everything, each time. You can't segment. You can't sort of scratch your head and say, who is it that I'm doing business with? This is a huge cost. And again, if we accept that, well, too much data, we want everything narrow, which is obviously where some of the civil society critics are, that is what it is. But it does have operational and financial and real impact. So let's look at the politics for a second. So obviously, industry has been seeking to push to either allow all these specific things or to have language that more broadly says that if I disclose it, it's fine. Many civil society groups have staffed up and are doing state level work and are advocating for the strong minimization standard. I know you had a chance to workshop the paper recently at a convening of many leading privacy academics. And what was their reaction? Did they see this as reasonable, as balanced? What was their take? Did they sort of instinctively side with the civil society groups on this question?
Yeah, so I'm, in my personal capacity, working on a sort of related paper, looking at the same subject, but taking a sort of different normative look at it, just because it's written personally. but covering much of the same subject matter, and it was really helpful feedback to get. I think a lot of people looking at this language, maybe for the first time, maybe not, were surprised at sort of some of the vagueness of this language, and in particular, whether or not it's taking the wrong approach necessarily, if it's introducing sort of legal uncertainty and maybe opportunity for outcomes that aren't as privacy protective, things like flooding people with consent pop-ups to make a product or service requested. I think everyone would agree that's not a good outcome for consumers. We don't want more consent fatigue. And so whether or not, asking questions around whether or not this is the right approach if you're looking for certain policy outcomes. And for example, if this is really about selling data or targeted advertising, maybe you don't need to fiddle with data minimization and try and expand it to be this broad concept to sort of implicitly do what you want it to do, when you can instead maybe try and pull different levers to get specific rules around those practices. Can you get to 90, if you're a privacy advocate who wants this kind of outcome, can you get 90% of the way there with a standard that's much clearer? So open questions around that. One of the interesting sort of very technical things I took away from that was around, in the Maryland language, it's not just reasonably necessary to provide a requested product or service, it's reasonably necessary and proportionate to provide a requested product or service. So that's something I'd like to think about, whether or not proportionate's doing any actual work there. That's a legal term of art, it has meaning, but is it really doing anything? And I find it interesting that for the sensitive data restriction, it's strictly necessary to provide a requested product or service. Proportionate isn't there. So that's one of the many sort of little, every time I look at this and sit back to it and come back to it, even though I've been looking at this language for a year, I find extra little nitpicky things that I want to think about.
So it's interesting, and one of our commenters references the HHS, OCR, BAAs, and HHS model language, and how they lean on that language. So what's interesting is that both GLBA, the banking financial law, financial institutions, and HIPAA and health covered entities, in many cases, those entities are carved out from some of these state laws. There's a more recent trend because you end up carving out the entire entity, even if they're using data that is not covered by those protections. And now you kind of have this over protection, or under, depending on how you look at it. But when we worked on HIPAA years ago, there was an understanding, right, that this was kind of a privacy law. Privacy is not in the title, we know. It was about moving data to the right people and places, but not the wrong people and places. So yes, insurance is going to need to get your data, and doctors should be able to easily share data with other doctors. And there's a role for research. And there's a role for your health provider reaching out to you, but not marketing to you plastic surgery when you came in with a broken elbow, but marketing appropriate things tied to that standard of care to you to provide the next service. Come in for your annual, when my dentist pings me saying, come in for my annual, checkup, like, yeah, they're marketing because they're going to pay for that. But like, that is kind of what we expect. And here we're doing these, rules without the full understanding of how the norms of data sharing through a particular ecosystem do, or not debating in a healthy way, right? Exactly. We debated exactly what and how HIPAA data should move. And in fact, in many cases, it's been too restrictive. I can't easily move it. Everyone tells me HIPAA when I want data going from one provider, to another, right? I go out of my network, but my network is, I want it to go to this specialist. And we know the challenges and the billions spent to try to advance electronic health records, and the perception that the privacy law limits it. But my point being that there are real consequences here, and there was language and detail and regs that gave real specificity because of how it impacted healthcare, financial data flows, and the economy. Here, we're regulating the entire rest of the economy. And I don't know that I could have a serious conversation with too many people in Maryland, including many of the policymakers, around what they think the law is, and will learn it with enforcement. Let's take a quick final question from Miles Light, our friend Miles. How should these minimization provisions be read in tandem with the consent language in MODPA? How about treating consent as an override for the minimization standard? Real hard, challenging question.
Yeah, I think that this is, again, one of the issues with the Merrill language in particular, is that processing is defined to include collection. And so you have this language saying limit your collection of personal data to what's necessary to provide a product or service. But then you also have this language saying that you can you can get consent to process personal data for reasons that aren't reasonably necessary to or compatible with your disclosed purposes. So there's a challenging interpretative question there that people have been raising. Does that mean that because collection is a kind of processing, I can just get consent in a way that overrides that restriction on collection? I think that'll be an interesting thing to see how the Attorney General interprets it. I think that arguably the more specific rule around collection probably overrides that. But again, if requested product or service means anything's requested if you get consent, then you're just back to the same place.
Although what's the point of the consent if it isn't providing you permission to do what the user is consenting to?
Yeah.
It seems like
that's a good question.
Could be a reasonable interpretation, but again, until we perhaps have a little more guidance from those who shall be the enforcers, we will not know. Thank you for raising the question, Miles. Please, folks, read the report. It's good weekend reading. Upload it into the Google Notebook and let it create a podcast where two voices will discuss and analyze. I did that actually just so I could re-listen after skimming the paper and doing some editing earlier. Hadn't come back to it, and I said, create me a podcast, and it does a pretty darn good job. And of course, not 100% accurate. Better you hear it from Jordan than from the Notebook LLM. But we got to figure out how to use AI in ways that are useful to support us, and this was one useful way for me. Have a great Friday. Jordan, congrats on a great paper. Folks, it's at the website if you didn't capture the link. And we look forward to following these issues with you further. Thanks, Jordan. Have a good weekend.
You too.
Happy Friday, everybody.